what's going on? Ryan Nolting here, Intersection Records. We're going to talk about Graham Parsons today. Graham Parsons is a pioneer in country rock. Okay, so he was in the Byrds, he was in the Flying Burrito Brothers. He did 2 seminal albums with Emmylou Harris. He kind of founded her and got her started on a career that still is great to this day. Let's talk about the man. Graham Parsons was born in Winter Haven, Florida in 1946. His mother was heir to a citrus fortune. It said that they were the 2 or 3 biggest citrus producers in the state of Florida. His mother was an alcoholic. His father worked for the company. He ends up committing suicide when Graham was 12. Before he did that, they had a second child, Graham's sister. Upon the suicide of his father at 12, his mother remarries a man with the last name of Parsons. This man adopts Graham, and Graham ends up seeing Elvis Presley live down in Florida in 1957, and it's said that he comes out of that show a different person. Everything going forward in his mind suggests that he can be a rock star, he can be a music star. In fact, some of his classmates have said that when he said that I'm going to be a star someday, they fully believed it. Again, he's from a rich family. He's kind of bulletproof in the sense that, you don't have a lot of insecurities when, everything's bought and paid for, and you're a nice looking guy. He learns how to play guitar. He goes off to school and has little bands growing up. He ends up, here's an excerpt from his high school yearbook that he wrote in somebody's yearbook. Perhaps someday we will both find out what we want. If so, we can't help but get it. In the meantime, we must suck the knowledge like cyanide from an old peach pit. See you in the playground of the stars. Until then, sound as ever, Graham. I thought that was an interesting thing to put in somebody's yearbook. Just one guy mentioning it. Poetic words from a 15-year-old boy. He ends up going to Harvard outside of Boston for college in 1965. He quickly meets up with some musician friends who introduce him to Buck Owens, the music of Buck Owens, Introduce him to the music of Lefty Frizzell. Introduce him to the music of Tom Jones. That's Tom with Tammy Wynette. This music really grips Graham. And yes, we have the Beatles invasion going on. We have the Rolling Stones. We have the Animals and the Who. But it's really the country music that Graham likes. Graham does not last long at Harvard. Graham barely studies. Graham barely goes to class. And he is asked to leave. But he takes these guys that he's met there, and they go down. By this time, Graham has a trust fund. He's able to buy a building in the Bronx, not only for his band to rehearse at, but also to live. They develop a band called the International Submarine Band. This is a band playing traditional country music and folk music, and also writing some material. In 1966, Graham goes out to Los Angeles. And on his first trip out there, he's introduced to the inner circle of the Los Angeles music scene. In fact, goes to a party at David Crosby's house and picks up David Crosby's girlfriend. He tells her, "I've been looking for you for a long time. You're coming with me." And he has a baby with this woman. He has met, kind of the hierarchy of of the LA folk scene and rock scene. He goes back to New York and convinces the band to move out where the scene is, and that is Los Angeles. He ends up getting a record contract, and the International Submarine Band does produce this record, which is called Safe at Home. This comes out in March of 68. It was recorded in different sessions throughout the year of 1967. It's got the Parsons pen songs Blue Eyes and Strong Boy. Also a song, Do You Know How It Feels to Be Lonesome, which he wrote with Barry Goldberg. This band ends up splitting up. Again, doing the kind of the country rock thing. By this time, Dylan has already gone electric. Dylan got turned on when the Byrds first came out. Of course, the band the Byrds from LA, their first single was Mr. Tambourine Man that Bob Dylan allowed them to record. That version turned Dylan on to the fact that, hey, you can dance to my music. I need to find some guys. So Dylan is going kind of folk rock direction. In 1967, around the time that the International Submarine Band is recording this album, he bumps into Chris Hillman from the Byrds at the bank. And Hillman's heard of Parsons, because Parsons has this reputation. He's a very electric guy and charismatic guy, and you can't help but like him when you're around him. Hillman, of all the guys in the Byrds, really has the biggest country music background. And upon David Crosby leaving the Byrds in 1967, in that first month or two of 68, they're looking to audition somebody. And who does Hillman call up? He calls up Graham Parsons. When they get there to jam, Parsons has a couple of his own penned songs. And the music that he's writing, along with his love for country, really solidifies their decision to hire Graham Parsons to be in the Byrds. And they put out this masterpiece, Sweetheart of the Rodeo. Okay. So this comes out in 1968. And this really kind of defines the sound of what country rock is. It's really a country album. Not everybody that comes out of the 50s and 60s, and not everybody goes down the rock road. There's still people that love, Hank Williams and the Everly Brothers and the Louvin Brothers. And that's what the Byrds really want to do here. Yes, rock and roll is what's popular with young people. But they want to show people that country music isn't necessarily for old folks. It can be kind of psychedelic too. This album starts off with a Bob Dylan song, You Ain't Going Nowhere. It's got a Louvin Brothers cover, The Christian Life. It's got two classics written by Graham Parsons, one called Hickory Wind and one called 100 Years From Now. Who does Graham Parsons meet during this time and become fast friends with is Keith Richards. Keith Richards is, of course, of the Rolling Stones. They meet each other and they're immediately connected like a brotherhood. And really, Keith says this, that it was like a brotherhood. That, they could play songs to each other. Graham could turn on Keith to some country, tell him about Lefty Frizzell, tell him about George Jones. And Keith can kind of turn Graham on to rock and roll. Here's a great picture of them in the back of a car. And you can see Graham right there and Keith there. They're hanging out. They're doing drugs. There's pictures and video where they're hanging out and they're and just playing acoustic guitars. And I don't think Mick Jagger is all that happy, because Mick's writing partners is Keith, and Keith's spending a lot of times with with Parsons when he's in town. And same with the Byrds. The Byrds are on tour, and they're going to do a show down in South Africa. And Keith tells Graham that, hey, this is going to be a segregated show. It's going to be an all-white show down in South Africa. And Graham decides not to do the show. He says, if everybody can't come, I'm not doing the show. And he doesn't show up to the gig. And Chris Hillman and Roger McGuinn are forced to fire Graham Parsons from the Byrds. After a few months, he reconciles with Chris Hillman. The Byrds basically break up after Parsons leaves. Hillman leaves the band. Ultimately, Roger McGuinn finds Clarence White and does more albums, and the Byrds continue. But after a few months, Hillman and Parsons reconcile and put this masterpiece out in February of '69. So this is The Gilded Palace of Sin, and it's got the classics, Wheels, it's got Sin City, and it's got Christine's Tune. These are songs written by Hillman and Parsons. Two songs that are written by Chris Eldridge and Parsons are the classics Hot Burrito 1 and Hot Burrito 2. Listen to those songs. Listen to Hot Burrito 1 sometime, and how different and touching it is. There's a vulnerability in his voice that's really hard to describe other than it's real. When somebody sings it and he has a good voice, but it's less than perfectly assured of himself, to where we as listeners can feel either the love that he's speaking of, or the pain that he's speaking of, or the unsureness. And the lyrics are so unique. He's still hanging out with Keith Richards here. Chris Hillman is a professional. He's been from the very beginning of the Byrds. Graham's got a trust fund. Every January he gets, I've heard on some accounts, $30,000 every January or $50,000 every January from his family trust fund. When you know that you have money like that coming in, you're not as hungry as some of the other musicians, because you're going to be okay. You're going to pay the rent. You know that everything's going to kind of be all right, which allows him to go screw around and take drugs with Keith Richards and jack around. Well, he's not cutting it. They put a second album out in 1970 called Burrito Deluxe. At this point, Bernie Ledden's brought on board to help support the guitar duties. Graham is not holding up his end of the bargain. He's jacking around. He's ultimately let go. The Burrito Brothers do a couple more albums and fizzle out themselves. At this point, he's a free agent. He doesn't have a band. He does secure a recording contract during the Exile on Main Street sessions. He goes over to the south of France and hangs out with the band, the Stones, for several weeks, to the point where he's almost asked to leave because they're not getting their work done, because him and Richards are screwing around too much. He does cover Wild Horses on that Burrito Deluxe album prior to the Stones putting the song out, I believe. Is Wild Horses inspired? I know that Keith Richards wrote it, but certainly inspired by the influence of the country-tinged Parsons material that their friendship had brought on. When he gets back, he asks Hillman, for some advice, and Hillman says, "You need to meet this girl from the Georgetown area of D.C. named Emmylou Harris." and he meets Emmylou, and they form a band together. In fact, again, Parsons is famous enough to be able to get some of the best guys on his record. He brings in Ron Tutt from Elvis's band on drums. He brings in James Burton on guitar. He brings Al Perkins in, and they produce their first solo album that comes out in January of '73, called GP. Again, Ron Tutt, James Burton, Al Perkins, Emmylou Harris, and Rich Gresh on bass. Emmylou Harris sings on every one of these songs. This is a fantastic album. Again, Graham's screwing around in the sessions. They do some gigs where they're fired because Graham is partying and taking drugs and drinking. And Emmylou Harris says, listen, guys, we need to get our shit together here. And she gets them to be able to hone the band in. This album has the Parsons song, A Song for You, Still Feeling Blue. It's got a great cover of the song Streets of Baltimore, which is one of the definitive versions of that song. And the new Soft Shoe. Chris Eldridge and Parsons wrote She. Of course, we talked about Eldridge and Parsons writing Operetta 1 and 2. This album is fantastic. If you don't know it, GP by Graham Parsons. That's followed up by this album that's recorded in 1973. This is Grievous Angel. This has the classic Return of the Grievous Angel. It's got $1,000 Wedding, and it's got Love Hurts. So Love Hurts is not written by Parsons, and I can't remember exactly who it's written by. I want to say Louvin Brothers or something. This is the definitive version, in my opinion. Again, Emmylou Harris is on every track on this album, I think, except one. He's still got James Burton and Ron Tutt and Al Perkins on this album. This is a legendary album. That same summer, Clarence White passes away. Clarence White took over lead guitar duties in the Byrds and is also a country rock pioneer. That really hurts Graham. In fact, Graham goes to the funeral ceremony and sings a song at the ceremony. In September of 1973, Graham Parsons goes out to Joshua Tree out in the desert, which he loves that area, and checks into a motel and parties all night with some tequila and some morphine. And he doesn't make it. He passes away. And there's stories about the body being stolen, and it's true. He did not want to have a funeral, a traditional funeral. He wanted to be cremated. His father had come back from New Orleans to get the body and bring it back to New Orleans and have it buried properly. His buddies do steal the body and impersonate hearse drivers and burn his casket out at Joshua Tree like his wishes were. That's a whole nother story. There's a movie, Grand Theft Parsons. Getting back to this man, he was a legend. I know this video is long. He had a fantastic career and really a pioneer when it comes to country rock. I want to salute Graham Parsons on a job well done and a beautiful career. Listen to the GP album. Listen to Grievous Angel. Listen to the Gilded Palace of Sin and Sweetheart of the Rodeo albums. Peace out. Subscribe to my channel if you like this content. We'll talk later. Thanks.